Okay, so I'm back with another video. This is the first in a series of videos that are focusing specifically on Star Wars, which is one of my favourite things of all time. Um, and so, no better way to start a series of videos about Star Wars and talk about the film that started it all, which was the original Star Wars, uh, known the way that I refer to it in my nerdy way is to give it its full title is Star Wars Episode 4: A New Hope, which is the very first Star Wars film that came out in 1977, of course, and then kicked off the whole Star Wars craze. And I luckily got the chance to see it again at the cinema today. After having already seen it re-released at the cinema in 1997, I missed it obviously in 77 because I wasn't even born. But I did see the re-release of it in 97 and watched it several times at the cinema. Actually, I think I watched it 3 or 4 times at the cinema when it was re-released, and then once again just earlier today. So I'm just going to give my quick thoughts on it. Like all this time later, does it still stand up? Are there any problems with it? Is it still as good as I remembered? Because I class that film as my favourite film of all time, to be honest. I always say it's my favourite Star Wars film. Yes, the others have some better points about them here and there. Yeah, obviously Empire is technically the best one, but I always give the credit to Episode 4 because without Episode 4 there wouldn't be an Empire Strikes Back, there wouldn't be Return of the Jedi, there wouldn't be a franchise called Star Wars without that first film. So even though the first film has bits in it that are superseded by some of the others, as an all-round package, as an all-round film, I still think it's the best. And when I watched it today, I still thought that. I think, to be honest, the great thing about Episode 4 is you could just watch it with absolutely no idea what Star Wars even is. You don't need to have any background knowledge. You don't need to know the characters. You don't need to know the world. You could just sit down and watch it, and I think it's an entertaining, accessible adventure film. I don't think you need anything, like a lot of these other shows, like Ahsoka, for example, you need to know, like, what's happened with that character for it to make any sense. And Star Wars used to be like this. It used to be very, very accessible. And that's why it was such a big hit, of course. And of course, it had to be because it was the first one. But one of the things that I like about it, like obviously the effects still hold up incredibly well, I think. I think from a design point of view, it's very much like Alien. I still look at it and marvel at it. I still look at it and marvel at how simple and primitive things were back then, but how it still looks really good for the most part. Like the model effects, the practical effects in the film, the way the stormtroopers look, the way Darth Vader looks, none of it looks cheap. None of it looks like it's just been thrown together. Even after all this time, I think it still looks really good. There are a couple of problems with it, what I'll get to in a minute, but in terms of the film that they shot in 1977, it still looks incredibly good. There's still a lot of appreciation I have for the world building, for the shots, for the detail that's in there, and I think a bit like Alien, the story is fairly simple, but it's rewatchable for the amount of detail and care that gets put into it. I still never get tired of seeing that, to be honest. There's many times I've seen Star Wars and I've seen it hundreds of times. I can't say how many times I've seen it now. It must be the most watched film I've ever. I mean, I know every single line of it, but there's something about seeing it at cinema that's different. It gives it a bit more oomph. The other thing that stands out, and obviously it's a pretty obvious thing to say, but how much the John Williams score elevates the film, like how much the score in that cinema just sounds so good, and it makes so many of the moments pop, so many moments like that are just the same as moments I've seen a million times on like a small screen or on streaming, but it just makes it work so much better. Star Wars was always meant to be seen at cinema, and I think it always just works best there. And particularly this particular film, there's so many sequences in this Star Wars film, particularly the Death Star trench run at the end, that just looks so good on a big screen even now. And again, that scene still looks great. It still works really well. But I think there's so much that's already been said about Star Wars in the past. There's not much I can really add to that conversation, but I'll just say the things that struck me about it. And I think it struck me about it more because this seems to be very almost totally absent from Star Wars these days. It's the sort of relatability of it. Like, it's a very relatable sci-fi world as much as it's alien. It's kind of both things at the same time. And the struggles and the things that happen in this world are very relatable to people. So things like, people not being able to go and do stuff they wanted. Like Luke has to go, instead of doing what he wants, he has to go clean up some droids. Like, the uncle just being like weather beaten, like having to go and hire some rubbish droids because this harvest isn't making enough, and Luke not being able to go to do stuff he wants, or having to wait another year to go to college, like them not having enough money to get from where he needs to go, Luke having to sell his speeder, not getting enough money for his speeder to get. It all feels like real world problems that people have. Like it's not a film with a lot of good things happen. It feels like a lot of bad things happen and continue to happen until the end when it suddenly turns good. But a lot of it's sort of a more relatable side, the more stuff that you can kind of relate to and feel like this is something you could experience in your own life. Like you can relate to the struggles that Luke has. And I think it's another film where I think it's perfectly paced. I don't think there's a film that's more perfectly paced than this first Star Wars film. And I don't know if that was just the editing. I don't know if it was George Lucas. I don't know who it was that made it as good as it was. But I just think that every single scene is essential, apart from a couple that I'll get into in a minute. I'm talking about the original film. Every single scene is essential, and every single scene builds on the last scene and gets better as it goes. So it starts off very exciting. A brilliant overhead shot of the starships flying through space, but again, that's just a good start. Then you get introduced to C-3PO, then R2-D2, then Princess Leia, and then Luke, and it all just builds and builds, and it's like each scene is better than the last one. It sort of builds on the intrigue, or it builds on the world, or it builds on the character, or it builds on the story, or it builds on the threat. There's nothing in there that you don't need. There's nothing in there that, like, there's no scene in that Star Wars film where I'd take that away. That's pointless, or that's dragging it out too long. It paces brilliantly, and it's just a great action adventure film. Whilst also developing character, we're also revealing character, we're also revealing bits about the world, which was mainly done through dialogue in the first Star Wars because he didn't have the budget to show a lot of it. Like, people obviously overlook the fact that there was a lot of politics in the prequels people didn't like, but there is a scene in this first one that addresses why there's no politics, really, because there's no political system to talk about, because once the Empire comes in, it's pretty much like there isn't a political system anymore, it's just a dictatorship. So there is no point having politics in it. It's just a case of the rebels against the Empire, and that's what it is. But it works in a way that, say, the sequel trilogy doesn't. Like, it's just more well thought out, and there's funny things in it as well that don't quite work, which I still like. I love it for its sort of foibles, bits where the ADR doesn't match, bits where, like, it looks like R2-D2's legs are about to fall off and stuff like that. But it was edited very, very well. And I think there's a lot of deleted scenes bear that out, because a lot of deleted scenes are absolutely terrible, and they do make it look like a student film. So it could easily have been much worse. But as it is, I think the shots that they got in there, and the contributions not just from George Lucas, but to all the other people, from the actors to the performers to Ben Burtt, who came up with the sound design for R2-D2, to John Williams, who did the score. It is a really big win. But one thing that I get slightly annoyed about, or actually a lot annoyed about, is people's attitude to George Lucas, because obviously when these original films came out, people thought he was a visionary, people thought he was amazing, and they attributed a lot of Star Wars success to him, and it is partly due to him. Like, and in the intervening years since the prequels came out, especially after Episode 1, everyone's tried to sort of either rubbish, not everyone, but a lot of people have sort of had to rubbish Lucas's input, tried to minimise it and say, well, he didn't really do much, he just sort of, the actors, he didn't really direct the actors well, he didn't really do stuff. And people want to sort of rewrite history and think that George Lucas wasn't an instrumental part of making Star Wars what it was. And that was part of the thing going into the sequels, was to deliberately go against what Lucas was kind of doing with it. But I've always felt that, like, well, no matter what your opinion on the prequels is, and the opinion on prequels is split, and you're perfectly valid in saying that there are things with those prequel movies that aren't perfect, I know that. But to suddenly rubbish everything that he did, to suddenly not understand that, it is possible for someone over a period of 30 years to sort of lose their edge, so to speak. It was very, very possible. In 1977, he made an amazing film, and in 1999, he couldn't make an amazing film anymore. There's many filmmakers who go through that arc. Like, Tarantino's even spoken about this, where he only wants to make 10 movies because he knows sooner or later filmmakers get off their game and they go downhill and they're not making good work as they used to. And George Lucas has only directed a few films, so he's sort of been out of it for 20 years. So really, there's no surprise, really, that Phantom Menace wasn't as well directed or as well done as the first Star Wars film. But I still don't want to take anything away from this first one. I still think it is really well directed, actually. There are a lot of the shots that are very nicely composed. It does feel cinematic. I mean, I think some people criticise its direction as being too pedestrian, but I do think that this first one feels cinematic. I think something like Return of the Jedi doesn't, I think Return of the Jedi is a wonderful film, but I don't think the way it's shot is particularly interesting. It is kind of just shot like a TV movie. It doesn't really feel like a film in a way it's presented, but I think Star Wars does. Like I think Star Wars and Empire have a really cool like directorial style that really feels like you can feel the director's hand there, and like even from the opening shot, there are so many beautiful cinematic shots in this film that I do think that it's well directed. I don't think that he's just popped the camera there and couldn't be asked. I really think it looks good. The shot compositions look good. It was eventually edited together very well, I think, like I said, which was done by him. There's this rumor going around that he didn't edit it. He did. He did the final edit all by himself before the film just actually came out. So he actually hand edited the last version before it got released. So this BS about how he didn't edit the film and it wasn't him that did it is a load of bollocks. And again, all these rumours that keep flying around trying to say like, oh well, Marcy Lucas was the one who came up with all the great ideas and it was really her that really created Star Wars and George Lucas didn't do anything. It's like, no, that's not true. Marcy Lucas came up with some cool ideas. She took them in the pot and they obviously helped make Star Wars what it was. I'm not downplaying Marcy Lucas's like input into Star Wars, but without George Lucas, there is no Star Wars. Like he's the one who came up with the characters. He's the one who came up with the world. He's the one who came up with the script. He's the one who pitched it to multiple, studios. Did what he had to do to get the money. He's the one who had Ralph McQuarrie who to draw his concept sketches. Even in the script stage, you have Ralph McQuarrie's drawings in there to sort of illustrate to studio heads what it was he was trying to make, because what it was he was trying to make no one had seen before. Like, and the shoot was a nightmare. Like, I think people really sometimes just want to make it out like George Lucas had almost nothing to do with why Star Wars was Star Wars, and it was all to do with other people. It's like, that's not true. I think he had a lot to do with why it was so good, and a lot of clear design choices that were very different at the time. And does that mean that everything he has ever done was brilliant? Does that mean that he's an amazing at writing dialogue or directing actors? No. But it does mean that he was amazingly good in a certain way that people shouldn't just rewrite history and try and pretend like he wasn't. Like he wasn't his vision that created it. It wasn't him that created it. It was all these other people. Like he hardly had anything to do with Empire Strikes Back. He was just producing it. It was mainly done by someone else. It's like, no, it wasn't. The story was him. The world was still him. The characters were still him. He was on set every day. He put his own money into Empire Strikes Back so it could get made without studio interference. So to say he had nothing to do with Empire Strikes Back being as good as it was is complete not a lie. But I'm getting into Empire now, so I'm ranting a bit. But I don't like this sort of idea that, Lucas had nothing to do with why Star Wars was good, or try and minimise George Lucas's like contributions to the thing that he actually created. And yes, he has struggled to direct actors. That's well documented. And yes, he struggles to write dialogue sometimes. But the dialogue, I think, in Star Wars is good. I think it's good for what it needs to be. Is it Shakespeare? No, but it's as good as it needs to be. And he was lucky to get great actors that elevated it. I mean, the performances in Star Wars are just so good. Like, as soon as Alec Guinness shows up as Obi-Wan, as soon as we get Han Solo as Han Solo, as soon as we get, Darth Vader, Princess Leia, like all those main players are just so good in that film. And that really was just nothing anyone could have planned for. No one would have known the amount of great actors you get to play roles like that, and they just phone it in. And that was probably Alec Guinness phoning it in, to be honest. That would have been his version of phoning it in, because he's such an amazing actor. But like, it didn't feel phoned in by him. It felt like he really did like believe in it. I think in a way that, like, say Marlon Brando in Superman didn't. Like, Marlon Brando in Superman was just reading lines off a cue card. You could tell he didn't give a shit about Superman. But with this, it felt like at least Alec Guinness faked it, if he didn't really feel it, that he cared, that he wanted to make Obi-Wan Kenobi come alive as his character. I think the funniest thing about the film, though, is there's a couple of negatives, which I will get into, because every film has them. One is, of course, the special edition ad editions. So if anyone doesn't know, in 1997, they added in a few scenes, added in some CGI elements to sort of update the film. And from a story point of view, I understand why they did that. At the time, it was just as the prequels were going to start rolling, and they probably wanted to make the films more in line with what the prequels were going to look like. So as an idea, I get it. But in execution, it just looks bad now. All those new shots that we added in, like substantially, the shots for Stormtroopers on the G-backs, for Jabba the Hutt scene, the approach into Mos Eisley, it all looks dreadful, and it's dated so badly. It's dated so much worse than any of the practical stuff has. And I think it's because the world feels real and gritty, and like you can touch it. It feels very tactile, the world of Star Wars. It feels very run down. That's what I mean about the relatability aspects of it. It feels like, things aren't working, things are kind of busted. This goes more into playing the Empire Strikes Back. Empire Strikes Back, like the Falcon's always breaking down and stuff, and it can only just get to light speed, or sometimes it can't. And that's the whole cool ethos of the very first trilogy of movies, is this sort of world where the future's sort of broken and needs fixing. Like R2D2 needs smacking on the head to sort of get him to work or something. It's like, that's what's cool about it. And I think Star Wars has lost that relatability aspect of it just being this broken, kind of rundown future. It's always this like pristine, amazing future where all the robots behave perfectly and nothing ever breaks and nothing ever goes wrong. And that's what adds a sort of fun to it, the fun aspect of Star Wars. But like the CG scenes that they added in, if they're gonna do that, they need to keep changing it up. I said to them, mate, they needed to go back to those scenes and do them again, or just remove them from it and go back to the original cut or whatever, because they look so bad. They really don't look good. The scene with Jabba the Hutt in particular, I just can't stand it. And it's funny because when I first watched it in '97, I absolutely loved it. But it's a pointless scene. It doesn't add anything to the film. It slows the film down, actually. It actually takes a lot away from the film, because you've just had a scene with Greedo where Greedo comes in and like basically reiterates everything that gets said in that scene with Jabba. And I said to my mate, it pretty much seems like even at the time they sort of knew at a certain point they weren't going to include that scene with Jabba in the final version, so they just took a lot of his lines and gave them to Greedo and shot the Greedo scene thinking, well, this is just the best we can do. And I actually kind of prefer the fact that we just got a mention of Jabba in the first one. Like, why do we need to see him in the first movie? There's just no real need to see Jabba at all we need is a mention of who Jabba the Hutt character is, and then we got to see him in Return of the Jedi. It was a much better payoff, I think, just to have someone hinted at and someone talked about. Same thing with the Emperor. Like, you only hear about the Emperor once, I think, in the first Star Wars movie, and he appears as a hologram in the second, and you only get to see him proper in Return of the Jedi. So that's a much better way of doing it than like talking about Jabba and then immediately see Jabba. And it's like, I guess if you watch films in sequence, that's not a big deal because you've already seen him in episode 1 or something, but watching it as a standalone film, that scene with Jabba just makes no sense adding in. It's just so rubbish. The CG looks dreadful. It doesn't look like he's there. It doesn't look like Han Solo's actually talking to him, which he wasn't, of course. And like I said, there's no new information added to the scene. It's just like, well, we know that he drops a shipment because of blah, blah, blah. We know Jabba's after him. We know all this stuff. And like, well, we already knew all that from the scene with Greedo. There's nothing new being imparted here. The only thing that's new is that Jabba gives him a bit more time and agrees to sort of lay off him for a bit, which takes attention away, if anything, because it's like, well, you just had a scene that's brought attention in, and immediately after that you take attention away. So what is the point? Like, it was much better in the original where you didn't have that Jabba the Hutt scene. He was just this mysterious figure, and all you knew is that Han needed the money. Han was being hunted. Han was like, he's sending bounty hunters after him and stuff. Whereas, like, in the redone version of the special edition, it makes it look like Greedo was just acting like a jackass, like he was just doing more than he should have done, and that really Jabba's not actually that bothered, and for an extra bit of money he's happy just to give Han a bit more time. And like, well, it just takes attention away from Han Solo's story and takes you, with that in there, you understand why he's so desperate to get the money, right? Because he needs that money to actually pay off Jabba so he's okay. He isn't just wanting the money because he's a greedy bastard, and that's part of the charm of him. Like, he sacrifices in the end that aspect of himself for the greater good, because he doesn't use the money to pay off Jabba. He sticks around with the rebellion, and then in the end, he gets frozen carbonite for it. So it's really good for Han Solo's character to know that he isn't just having that money. He needs the money because he desperately needs to pay this person back for this thing that's screwed up. So it gives him a bit more of a well, there's a reason why he's doing it. He's not just being an arsehole and wants money for the sake of money. He wants money to get himself out of a situation he's got himself stuck in. So I think that makes him more likable. Whereas if you then take that away and go, well, he actually doesn't need to pay it right now, why is he still that bothered about the money? Like, he could just say, oh, well, Jabba needs this in some point, I'll give him a bit now, and it just takes the piss, I think. The redone shots of Greedo and Han firing as well, this has been talked about Adam for that by nerds, like, who shot first? It doesn't really matter. But the original version, the first version of Star Wars, where he just shoots him on the table, to me, makes much more sense. Very straight, clear cut. He shoots Greedo first. Greedo's threatening his life. Greedo isn't going to take no for an answer, and I think in that situation, it's self-defense, essentially. Like, I don't think Han's a villain for shooting Greedo in that point, because Greedo's come and brought that to him. Greedo's actually got him at point-blank range and could have actually shot him. So, yes, he does it under the table. He's not, like, saying, right, we're going to go outside, because that's just Han Solo, but I don't feel that he is a worse character for just shooting him under the table. And the idea that Greedo would miss at that short range is kind of stupid. But overall, I'm not going to get into it. Just the original version of that was better. That scene was better. But The problem is as well that while a lot of the special editions are making the film markedly worse, there are a number of things that actually make the film a bit better. One of which is a scene where Luke meets Biggs and talks to Biggs, because in the original version, Biggs is this character that gets mentioned, but you don't really know who the heck he is. Like, Luke mentions him like once, if you don't see him with Uncle Owen, and then later on he's flying around and he's talking to Biggs, and you're like, well, what's going on? It doesn't really say anything about Biggs, but this scene, the special edition actually added in a deleted scene where he meets up with Biggs and he talks to him for like 2 minutes just before the final act. And I think that was a really good scene, having that in there, because there was originally a scene where he talks to Biggs at the start of the film before Biggs is kind of telling him that he's going to go off and fight with the rebellion sort of thing. But that is a really bad scene. Like, it looks terrible. It looks like a student film. The acting's not good. So I understand why they didn't keep it in. But I think this scene of a special edition was a good way of us knowing who he was. If we only get like a couple of minutes of it, yeah, he's not a big character or anything. He's just a tiny side character. But it still made a bit more actual sense of the film. But fans often forget, I think, that didn't make much sense in the original cut at all. What else was better? The lightsabers look a lot better in the special edition, much more colourful, much more to them. Like, in the original version, sometimes the lightsabers looked really frail and pathetic. Like, Darth Vader's looked kind of pink. It didn't even look red in some scenes. There's even some scenes in the original where it was white. It was just a white stick. It hadn't done the effects on it. So the lightsabers look much better. The stuff like the laser blasts look better. There's some extra shots with the ships that look really good. Some of the CGI ones that I didn't look really bad, and you can tell it's bad CGI from 1997, but most of it looks good. And I just feel like the Death Star trench bit is just a tiny bit better in special edition as well. And also things like the explosions, like the explosion of Planet Yavin is so much better in the special edition, and the explosion of the Death Star is so much better in the special edition. In the original cut, it's just it's fine, but it's not a really big moment. But like I said, the problem with special edition is those extra scenes he added in, the CGI scenes that are all kind of pointless. You don't need any of them in the film. They don't further the story any. They kind of just ruin it a little bit. But I also am not one of those fans who is just like, well, the films are ruined unless it's the original cut. Like, they overreact about the special editions, and they're like, special editions, oh shit, it's ruined Star Wars. It hasn't really done that much to ruin Star Wars. It's a couple of scenes that are a bit pointless, and yeah, maybe they do bring it down a bit as a viewing experience, but it's a tiny bit. It's like, it's not even half a point. You know, if I was going to rate it as a 10 out of 10, it's still a 10 out of 10 with the special edition, because some things are slightly better, some things are slightly worse. But, you know, ultimately, it would be good to do an ultimate cut where you sort of have the best of both. So you still have a scene with Biggs, which I think was a good addition. You still have things like I said that are good, but you take out like the Jabba the Hutt scene, you take out the stupid thing with Mos Eisley, and you take out whatever else I said. There was something else that was really bad, some bad CGI. The scene with the stormtroopers up a Dewbacks, just get rid of them out of the shot. Like, the shot was fine, you didn't need it. I really don't know what it added to it. I think just, you know, it's the old thing that Jeff Goldblum says in Jurassic Park, which ironically I think inspired these changes, which is they were so preoccupied whether or not they could, they didn't start to think of it. They didn't start to think if they should. Like, yes, you can now render in 1997 CGI a Dewback with a stormtrooper on it, but should you really bother doing that? Should you really bother putting that in when it doesn't add anything to the story, doesn't add anything to the scene really? And 20 years later, when you watch it, it looks like crap. It's like those scenes just stick out like a sore thumb, that they just don't look right. But having said that, if you were just a newbie and you'd never seen Star Wars before, you'd no idea what it was, I bet you wouldn't even notice what these scenes are. You'd have no clue what I'm even on about. You'd just be like, I don't know, it's just a film. And on that score, the last thing I'm going to talk about Star Wars before I go is it's funny because I think as a standalone film, so why it's my favourite, it's the best. It's the best one. You can just watch it. You don't need to know any knowledge of Star Wars. Don't need to know who Luke is, who the Jedi is, or anything. It lays all that so cleanly, so clearly, and so well defined, I think, that I find it odd that it's been perverted and changed recently to the exact opposite of what it is. The idea that the dark side is clearly evil. It's even mentioned as being evil in this film, but anyway, I'm not going to go back into Acolyte again, but yeah, it establishes the rules of Star Wars really well, really clearly, really simply. Establishes unusual things like the Force really clearly, really simply. And yes, Empire goes into more detail in those things, but it's first there in Star Wars. Like, Star Wars has to do so much groundwork, Empire doesn't have to do the same amount of groundwork. That's why my respect goes to Star Wars, because of the amount of things they had to do all at once in one movie. Empire doesn't have as much. You already know the characters, you already know the world sort of, you already are familiar with things like the Force, things like the Jedi, things like Luke. You know a little bit, and then you can spend more of the film going into more detail and improving on those, which it does in an amazing way. But you couldn't just start with Empire, I don't think. If you just jump straight into Empire, you've missed a lot of the context. A lot of the stuff won't hit the same unless you've seen the first Star Wars. But whilst the brilliant start to a trilogy, the original trilogy, and a brilliant single standalone film, if you actually watch it in the order you're meant to watch it, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it isn't so good because of the way they made it. They made it first, and it was made and viewed at the time. The choices they made making it was just a standalone one-off film. There was no knowledge that Star Wars was going to be this big franchise. No knowledge they would do episodes 1, 2, and 3 or anything like that. I mean, when Star Wars first came out to cinema, it didn't even have that title on it. It didn't have Episode 4 on it. It was just Star Wars. That was all it was called. And of course, when it was a big hit and it got the others, they started adding the episode titles on later. So, initially this film would just have been called Star Wars, and that would have been it. But now, when we look back, some of the continuity doesn't make any sense. Like characters that referring to other characters should know who those characters are. And some of the Disney Plus shows have made that even more of a problem, because the Obi-Wan show, you have Leia meeting Obi-Wan, meeting Leia when he was a little kid, and then when this Star Wars film, it's obvious they've never met. There's never reference to it because obviously it wasn't made at the time. So there's all sorts of continuity errors, like loads of things that like Obi-Wan says to Luke that are blatant lies now because that never actually happened, like saying how his father wanted to have his lightsaber when he was old enough, his uncle wouldn't allow it. I'm like, well, no, that never happened. But again, it's just one of those things. I overlook it. Some fans can't get past it, but I do overlook it. I still like to watch. I still view Star Wars as these 6 films, but the biggest jump in logic you've got to make is between 3 and 4, because that's the biggest change as well. Because you're talking about a film that was made in 1977 as a standalone film with no idea that you're going to get 2 more. Like, yes, you want to make 2 more, but there was no guaranteed certainty of it when you first made Star Wars, versus Revenge of the Sith in 2005, which is like so many years later when all the Star Wars films are done, and you're trying your best to sort of knit it all together and make it into one big saga. And while he did thematically make it work, and in some ways it did follow on from episode 3, there's still a big jump in a lot of stuff. And that's why I actually personally quite liked having Rogue One as a sort of in-between film, because Rogue One, I think, transitions quite nicely into the original trilogy, and I think the Obi-Wan show to some extent too as well. Like a lot of stuff that bridges that gap, that 15, 16 year gap between 3 and 4. Some of the Disney stuff, if there's a good thing with that Disney Star Wars, they've sort of eased that transition from episode 3 to episode 4 a bit more, because it is really different. It's like night and day when you go from episode 3 to episode 4. But when you get into episode 5 and 6, they start to kind of talking more about things that were in the prequels, and Revenge of the Sith and Return of the Jedi are quite similar in a lot of ways. So it becomes a film, a 6-part that works. But episode 4 is the one that really struggles, because it wasn't made as an episode 4. It was made as a standalone film, obviously, just because of the way it was at the time. So that's a funny thing about that. So that's the only really negative I've got about it. And it isn't really a negative from a certain point of view. It's only a negative if you're wanting to watch Star Wars 1 through to 6 or 1 through to 9. It stands out as a weird one in that series, watching it in chronological order. But if you watch in the order they were made, like if you start with 4, 5, 6 and then you go 1, 2, 3, I think it works fine. Or a lot better anyway. Right, I've talked about Star Wars for about half an hour, so I'm going to stop this video now. That's really all I have to say about it. It's still my favourite film of all time. I absolutely loved it. Seeing it again, I'm still in awe of this film. Like, I still, all these years later, still love it. I saw it when I was about 4 years old. I saw it at cinema when I was in my teenage years, and I've seen it now again at 40 odd. So, yeah, I really love this film, and I'm always going to. Still my number 1 film of all time. Will I get to see the others at the cinema? I'm not sure. I know some of the others have been playing, and I know Empire's playing. I'd like to see that. If I do, I'll do a review for that. But really, this is the only one I need to see at the cinema again. Like, the others are all great in their own way, but as I said, none of the others are quite self-contained as this one. Like Empire, you kind of need to have seen the first Star Wars, and really to get the proper satisfaction, you need to watch Jedi right after it. Like Empire, just watching Empire by itself, I find a bit like, it's like watching Back to the Future 2 without watching Back to the Future 3. I'm like, no, I need to see the next one now. So yeah, I might check Empire out, but I might not. I'll see. This is the one that I really, really like the best out of all the Star Wars movies. So there we go. I'm glad I got to see it one more time at the cinema. And yeah, that's that. So this is the perfect first video to do in my like playlist of Star Wars themed videos. couldn't have had a better start than watching the one that started it all, first of all. I'll be back soon with more Star Wars, content and rants and stuff.